So in the last couple of weeks, after I'd filmed this entire video, Armie Hammer came out with an interview addressing the allegations against him, and one of Armie's alleged victims also came out in response to Armie's interview, and she had some texts and receipts that seemed to contradict what Armie had said in the interview. Anyway, if you're interested in all the updates, I'll put all of those at the end of the recap. Anyway, onto the video. Episode 1 starts with a recording of Armie telling a woman about his fantasy of coming over to her house with a bag of rope, incapacitating her and doing whatever he wanted to every orifice in her body. We see a run through of all the reporting as the Armie story broke, and then his aunt comes onto the screen saying that there's a dark side that runs in that family. Courtney, who is the main Armie survivor telling her story in this documentary, sits in front of the camera then to discuss the details of her relationship with Armie and how she got to a point where she was almost fully controlled by him. In December 2019, she was out in Dallas and she saw him. They spoke in passing at a bar, and he later added her on Instagram. In June 2020, he reached out to her in her DMs. She asked if he was married, but he told her that he and his wife had been separated for 2 years. He told her some pretty personal family issues, and so she opened up to him as well, and of course he was showering her with compliments. Then we get to a brief summary of Armie's career. The documentary starts with when Armie was cast as the Winklevoss twins in the Facebook movie The Social Network. Then he got cast in Call Me By Your Name, which really catapulted him, and well, rather, Timothée Chalamet got the most recognition for it, but we'll hear that after a string of Hollywood duds, which after The Social Network, which was a big hit, this would be his first hit years after that first one. Obviously, Armie Hammer is not just the handsome movie star, but he's also the grandson of Armand Hammer, the oil tycoon. Armie was raised in the Cayman Islands, and his family returned to LA when he was in grade 7. We then fast forward to his rising star again with his role in Call Me By Your Name. Now he's the perfect movie star with the perfectly beautiful wife on press tours and red carpets. His movie career seems to be on the up and up. This journalist who had taken an interest in him and had spoken to Armie said that there were no controversies around him except that there were whispers of him being into BDSM. When he asked Armie about it, Armie decisively shut that down. I should just add that we don't actually get a lot of information about his upbringing in the Cayman Islands, which I found kind of a pity, and this documentary does kind of jump around a bit. Julia Morrison, an artist and writer based in LA, comes onto the screen and she starts by showing a very weird message from Armie, basically saying that one of his fantasies is having his lover tied up in a town square and having random people do whatever to her, and in this way, the woman shows her devotion to him. Anyway, he had added her on Instagram some years ago and messaged her about her art, but she somehow missed that message until 3 years later, around the start of COVID, about the same time that Armie was texting Courtney. Anyway, Julia responds to this 3-year-old message, and she says that he responded back within an hour. He started chatting to her, telling her that she was so perfect and that he was intrigued by her art. So they started texting sexual stuff, him saying that he wanted to tie her up and be dominant, and they did this for around 6 months. She figured that since he was married, she probably wasn't the only one he was doing this with. Back to Courtney, at one time Armie had told her that he'd be passing through Dallas and he obviously wanted to see her, but she had already arranged a trip to the Hamptons with friends. She says that he got a bit upset with her, and he also took a photo of her building in Dallas, telling her that he was trying to find her scent. By the time she got back, he had left a note for her saying that he was going to bite her. At this point, it's still meant to be kind of edgy and sexy and cute, I guess. Not bite isn't to eat. 6 days later, Elizabeth, Armie's wife, and Armie released a joint statement that after 13 years together, they're ending their marriage. We also don't get that much information about Elizabeth and Armie's marriage and their courtship. This show is mostly about the survivors. Courtney decided to go to LA to visit Armie in August 2020. He wanted to take her for an adventure out on the desert with her dog in the car, and they spent every day of the following 3 weeks together. He was really attentive. His hand was always on her leg. He always wanted her close, and she said she was starting to fall for him. She couldn't believe that this was happening. This is Armie Hammer after all. But she says there were times that things didn't feel right. One day they went to a hardware store to get rope, but the store was out, and Courtney says that she was relieved, and she says that Armie sensed that this was out of her comfort zone, so he softened a little. Then he got them to watch the movie The Secretary. She says that something then happened between them that night, and she didn't really give consent, that you usually talk about things like that before you do them, but they didn't talk about it. The show mentions that she doesn't feel comfortable going into the details of that incident though. So after this, Courtney got home and she started really struggling with anxiety. Her body knew that something wasn't right, But Army was still giving her so much affection and attention, and she still liked that. Then Army was spotted with Rimmer Willis, daughter of Bruce Willis and Demi Moore, and of course these photos made it into the tabloids. He told Courtney that it meant nothing. Courtney managed to end it anyway, but Army was persistent and he kept on texting her. He also had her location on his phone, and he found her. Well, he showed up to where she was, determined to win her back, and she kind of found it romantic, so she fell back in with him. She also says that there were signs that things were off, like she had marks on her body, he'd bite her, and then he'd make her feel special for it. Then the vibe changed again, and it's as though Army needed something more edgy, I guess. So on another trip, he brought some ropes. He'd been on edge during dinner, then he spoke to Courtney about the ropes that he had, and he told her that he'd only ever tied up mannequins, not people. I did have a hard time believing that he'd never tried it on other women. Nobody really knows, but this could just be a line that he gave to her. Anyway, they don't say. The point is, he wants to try it. Courtney said that she said everything except no. Like, she told him that she didn't feel good, and it's clear that there was no enthusiastic consent. Anyway, he tied her up, and she said she felt completely immobilized. She didn't feel safe. Then she says that he started to unravel, but he pulled her even closer and suggested that she meet his mom. They broke up 2 days after meeting his mom. Too much damage had already been done. Candace, a pop culture curator, finds leaked DMs from Army's ex-girlfriend online, and she decides to look into it more. Back to Courtney, she then goes on the record about Army, saying that some of the things in the leaked text are the same things that he sent to her. One of the really shocking ones was him confessing to one of the women that he was a cannibal. Once Courtney came forward, Jessica also came forward. Hollywood at this time was dropping him from upcoming movies, his reps were dropping him. Then things from his past came out, like little bits and pieces where he revealed what he was into, but obviously not the full extent of it. A Playboy interview with him saying that he was into bondage, his social media where he liked photos or videos depicting rope play. Apparently what he was doing wasn't actually BDSM. This was a misrepresentation, because in BDSM, safe words and communication, boundaries and consent are all really important, but what Army was engaged in was actual abuse, allegedly. Then Gloria Allred, a famous Hollywood attorney known for taking on high-profile cases where women have been hurt by men, took on Effie, Army's ex's case. Effie is the brains behind the Instagram account House of Effie, which was instrumental in exposing Army. She then posted a video saying that when she was with him, the relationship progressed really quickly as Army pushed the boundaries and tested Effie's devotion to him. There was every kind of abuse in the relationship, and she claims that he was violent. She describes a 2017 incident where he was repeatedly sexually violent to her for hours, and this sparked an LAPD investigation, and in response, Army retained legal counsel from a firm known for representing abusive types in Hollywood. Then another entertainment journalist type is tipped off that there is some darkness in the whole Hammer family dating back generations, and she finds the book that Army's aunt Casey Hammer had written. Casey then gets a notification about the viral videos about the men in her family. She was scared of what her estranged family might do to her, but she was also relieved. So Armand, Casey's grandfather, was an oil tycoon who never took no for an answer. And her father, Julian, she says, had guns all over the house, and he'd shoot at her with them. It's implied that it's to scare her, obviously, rather than to kill her. At the end of the episode, Casey starts to describe how her brother Michael had that darkness in him as well. In episode 2, Casey Hammer drives through the exclusive neighborhood where her grandfather's house was. The Hammer family was part of the elite, and they were perfect on the outside, but they were a family of dark secrets. There's a photo with a little Army carried by his great-grandfather. Casey's mother initially had no idea that her husband was the son of the famed Armand Hammer. Her father was a drunk and a bit of a mess, even though Armand wanted him to take responsibility and pull his weight in the family business. Casey says that one evening when she was 5 on Christmas Eve, she heard her parents fighting. Her mother was covered in blood and her father was threatening to kill her. The fighting was a regular occurrence, and as she got older, her father got worse. Casey's mother wanted to leave, but Armand had threatened to ruin her life. Armand had files on everybody. Family was being watched by him for them to maintain their pristine public image. The grandfather, Armand Hammer, had access to the Kremlin, the White House, and Buckingham Palace, an unthinkable amount of power. When she was 11, Casey's mother had finally had enough. When Casey's parents finally got divorced, The Hammers destroyed Casey's mother in court, and her father ended up only having to pay $200 in child support. Casey's mother had said that her biggest regret was letting Michael, Casey's brother, stay with her father. And it was a while before Casey's mother even let her visit her father. But when she did, one Christmas, there were a lot of young women, 16 and 17-year-olds at the house at this Christmas party. There were drugs and there was drinking. They had these giant orgies, and her brother would bring his friends as well. A lot of sexual debauchery, and she was exposed at a young age to the idea that women were disposable to the Hammer men. In 2021, a video came out of Army looking around his hotel room, and there was a woman on all fours on his bed. At this time, he also had a private Instagram account where he openly posted about his deranged behavior with drugs and drinking. Don't really know how private this was then. A journalist talks about the time that he traveled the world with grandfather Armand Hammer as he was writing a profile on him. Armand had had 3 marriages, and one of his ex-wives in the court papers had said that he threatened her with physical violence and basically engaged in behavior deliberately designed to break her will. She feared him and referred to him as a master of psychological warfare. In private, he always had a mistress whom he had complete control over. Once, his wife found out and demanded that he end it, but Armand instead got his mistress to completely change her identity. He had his mistress's phone tapped, a device in her home. He controlled her whereabouts, where she went on holiday, and she had to submit to him sexually even when she found the acts humiliating. Then they interviewed Jillian's one-time housekeeper. Jillian, remember, is Casey's father. She says that she showed up to one of the infamous house parties, and she describes Jillian as the Hugh Hefner of the Pacific Palisades. Then Jillian started opening up to her, and she got to see the man behind the public persona. Eventually they got engaged, and he got more possessive as they went on. He didn't like her having any friends or being too independent. One night after dinner, he took her to a gay bar and was flirting with the men there, and she wanted to leave, but he didn't. Eventually, when someone else brought her home, Jillian threatened the guy with a gun. Of course, Armand had the money to make this all go away, and shortly after this, the marriage ended. Armand also paid big money to squash the potential murder charges against Jillian, when Jillian allegedly shot a friend over a gambling debt. So yeah, the Hammers could literally get away with murder. Jillian then went into the family business to run criminal errands on Armand's behalf, like making secret recordings of certain conversations for potential blackmail purposes in the future. The documentary then goes back to Armand's father, Julius, a Russian Jew who had come over to America. He was a doctor, politician, and founder of the American Communist Party. In fact, he named Armand, his son and the grandfather, after the arm and hammer symbol. The CIA also concluded that Julius was sending secrets to the KGB. Armand also became involved in some of those activities, but of course he tried to distance himself eventually from his Russian connections. This distancing also then included his son Julian, so they had a fraught relationship. In fact, all of the Hammer men did. For example, at a party, Casey says that her father Julian had offered her brother Michael $1 million for his girlfriend. They got into a brawl, and somehow at the end of it, the girlfriend ended up going with Jillian, the father, to tame the situation. And the girlfriend, though, ended up living with Jillian for another 8 months. Michael, Casey's brother, was the life of the party on campus at uni. Almost every one of her friends ended up sleeping with him at some point. Apparently, he was quite charismatic. Then grandfather Armand came in and demanded that Michael come into the family business, clean up his act, or essentially be cut off. Casey's father didn't care too much about the ritzy life, but her brother Michael really wanted to be the heir apparent. Michael then met Army's mother, Drew. She was absolutely not the typical woman he went for on account of her being religious and wholesome. At the time, while they started seeing each other, Michael was still partying on the down low. Still, they eventually went on to get married, and Army was born, named after his grandfather, of course. In 1990, Armand died, and while on his deathbed, Michael and Drew started looting the house. It's not really explained how Drew went from wholesome church girl to shady co-grifter. They went through the reading of the will. They went through the reading of Armand's will, and Casey got $250,000 cash. I believe that Jillian got around $500,000, and Michael got the Rolls Royce, and he was made executor of the estate, along with his wife Drew. At this time, Armand had $40 million, and that all got passed on to Michael. Apparently this was a new will, though, that was signed 40 days before he died. So $40 million is a lot of money, but for someone like Armand, it's not much. The family thought that he was a billionaire, but he had given away a lot of his money. Anyway, Michael took the lion's share, So there was some family infighting. Back to Courtney in the present day, she says that Army spoke of the evilness of the men in his family almost as though it was a badge of honor. And she says that when she went to meet his mom, some deep-rooted family trauma and secrets were spilled that night. At the end of the episode, the interviewer asks Casey, Army's aunt, if her father had been essaying her. Her eyes are teary, but she doesn't answer as the credits roll. In episode 3, Courtney says that after the rope scenario and meeting Army's mom, she started to disassociate. She decided then to go to rehab, and she reads a diary entry of how disappointed she was with herself for how she let him use her for months. She then gets a text about Army's new girlfriend, gorgeous girl, but in a lot of her photos, she has visible bruises. This girlfriend says that Army made her feel like it would be sexy and safe. He also told her that he was looking for a doctor to remove some of her ribs so that he could smoke them and eat them. He was obsessed with meat, apparently. Army knew that by going for young women with no experience, he could slowly mentally work on them to make them submit. At some point, Army also carved his initials into her. We also hear from a guy who had worked with Army, and he recognized some of those controlling traits. Army used his position as this guy's boss to get him to do things that the guy didn't feel comfortable with, like pressuring him to get a lap dance at a strip club or making him go on long drunken joy rides. So remember, Michael and Drew had taken control of everything after the death of Armand Hammer? Well, Drew's father then announced to everybody that on his deathbed, Armand had changed his religion. He converted from Judaism and he accepted Christ. So Michael and Drew started putting all of Armand's money into Christian causes. Michael had also been rumored to have a sex throne with a meat hook on it and a cage underneath. After Armand's death, Gillian gave a lot of his secret documents to a journalist. Remember, he had a lot of recordings of conversations that were to be used for blackmail purposes. This wasn't small-time stuff either. He wasn't bribing cops to get out of speeding tickets. He was like bribing the president of Venezuela. Anyway, after the fallout with the will, Gillian decided that he was ready to out his late father for his crimes. Back to Armand when he was still alive. He had once pled guilty to an illegal campaign contributions charge connected to the Nixon campaign, so his image needed a little cleanup, and that's when he set his sights on Prince Charles. He threw Charles and Diana a gala and gave tens of millions of pounds to Charles's causes. George Bush Sr. ended up pardoning Hammer for his Nixon misdemeanor charge. Then one of his offshore platforms of the Hammer Company blew up and 167 people died. At the time, Armand went up to the cameras and took responsibility, gave the performance of his life, acting contrite, so much so that journalists didn't ask the hard questions about the deplorable safety standards on the platform. The PR stunt worked. Later in the day, he called people to have some champagne and caviar because, according to him, he'd had a great day. He took no interest in the well-being of the survivors or the people who had died, though. Later in life, Casey moved in with her father, Gillian, who was deteriorating as he got older. He was mentally unwell, though, and she felt unsafe, so she moved again and eventually got help. During therapy, she says that the floodgates opened with her childhood memories and all of the abuse. She did speak to her mother about it, and finally, she says that yes, her father did SA her. She said that she never confronted him about it, though. It was October 2020 when Courtney went to rehab. She was diagnosed with trauma and PTSD, and she says that she had to come to terms with being used, abused, and discarded by Army. Army's then girlfriend, because unfortunately, no matter how much comes out about him, he'll still be able to manipulate some people through no fault of their own, also reached out to Courtney, and they compared stories, and a lot of the things that he did with Courtney, he did with his new girlfriend as well. Some good news for Army at this time is that the assault charges weren't going to be moving forward. Somehow TMZ got the early scoop on that story. Then, in May 2021, it was announced that Army would be going to rehab. Army seemed maybe to be turning his life around and doing well. Well, this was the narrative that his people tried to push at the time, but as we know, that rehabilitation tour didn't quite stick. This was around the time that the big movie Death on the Nile was coming out. Everyone was kind of thinking that at this point he might make a comeback. The women that came forward with their stories about Army were harassed and shamed by unhinged Call Me By Your Name fans, and Courtney even had to move because of it. She also did get a stream of support from people who could relate, people who realized because of her story that they needed to get out of their toxic situations. In November 2021, Courtney and Casey met for the first time to commiserate. Casey then reads out a letter from her brother Michael the grifter, allegedly, who she hadn't spoken to in years. He wrote in the letter that he had heard the untrue things, the lies that she'd spread about their family and the company, and he couldn't allow her to continue her invented stories. He threatened to pursue legal action against her should she continue to speak out. But to date, no criminal charges have been filed. And yeah, that was the 3 episodes of House of Hammer. Right, so starting with this airmail interview in which Army tells his side of the story, he says that he and Effie, one of his alleged victims, reached out to him on Facebook about a charity for special needs children, and Army does have a son with autism. After a while, he told her that he needed to stop chatting with her because having casual conversations with a girl online would make my life really difficult. To this, he says, Effie responded, "I used to work in a dungeon and I totally understand how discretion works." Army then says, when Effie told him that she used to work in a sex club, it probably wasn't a week later that I had been messaging her a lot, like throughout the day, and it got extremely explicit. According to Hammer, what Effie would later describe as R was a scene that the two planned out meticulously in advance via conversations over Facebook Messenger. Army also claims in this interview that these messages, which he since deleted, would exonerate him, and that his lawyers have tried to subpoena them from Meta to no avail. "If I still had these messages, I would have been able to put this to bed in 0.5 seconds, he says. This alleged R was a scene that was her idea. She planned all of the details out, all the way down to what Starbucks I would see her at, how I would follow her home, how her front door would be open and unlocked, and how I would come in and we would engage in what is called a consensual non-consent scene." Hammer says that while he and Effie had sex multiple times, we only had one scheduled CNC event, and that Effie introduced him to the practice. Jumping to Effie now, her response to this in particular kind of contradicts what Hammer says here. In a text that she released from Army, he's the one asking her if she is into this consensual non-consent roleplay. And if she was the one who introduced him to the idea in the first place, why would he be asking her this? According to Hammer, his affair with Effie lasted until the summer of 2017. Hammer says that while he never considered the relationship to be anything other than sexual in nature, Effie harbored hopes of his leaving Chambers for her. Elizabeth Chambers was Army's wife at the time. She called me one day and said, "I'm going to tell your wife." Hammer pleaded with Effie to reconsider, and after urging back and forth, she decided to wait 24 hours so that he could warn Chambers in advance. "I don't like who I'm becoming," Hammer confessed to his wife. "I'm effed up every single day, all day. I'm miserable, I'm unhappy, and I'm having an affair. And I don't know how to stop any of these things, and I can't do this alone. I need your help." Chambers, he said, took it really poorly, which is fair. So remember in the same interview, Army had said that if he got hold of those messages, which he has since deleted, they would exonerate him. Well, Effie called his bluff on that, and she released some of those messages. Obviously, I'm not going to read Army's nonsense, but I'm going to put them up on the screen. They're pretty bad. In this interview, Army also goes on to talk about an incident when he was 13 years old where he'd been abused by a pastor in the church. Now, at the time, he told his parents that the pastor had made him feel uncomfortable without really divulging what was happening, but the parents kind of brushed it off. Remember, his mother was a staunch Christian at the time. He did, however, at the time, tell the details of this abuse to an older friend who has since passed away and to his godmother, who had actually confirmed this to the paper, the Airmail, who are conducting this interview with Hammer. Obviously, as a child, this had made him feel powerless, and moving forward as an adult in his sexual relations, he sought control. But he says in this interview that just because he wanted to be in control, this does not manifest as a compulsion to be violent with women. He's adamant that he never engaged in non-consensual sex with any of his partners, nor, he says, does he derive pleasure from the idea of it. Then further along in this article, things get a little murky, where we see that Effie, in some DMs, had expressed how much she had enjoyed the sexual activities with Army, and she says in the DMs that it was consensual. The writers of the article tried to reach out to her, but they didn't hear anything back. Another murky detail is that Army had quite a significant pectoral injury around the time. It was so bad that he would have needed 6 months to rehabilitate, and this was publicly documented. And this supposedly brings into question whether he was able to be violent the way that Effie describes at the time. The article then goes on to explain that after this traumatic incident between Effie and Army, this affair of theirs had obviously ended by then, but she continued to kind of stalk him around Europe. She followed him to the London premiere of Call Me By Your Name. She went to Crema, where Call Me By Your Name was filmed, and she got a selfie with the director of the film. In December 2018, Armie had requested that the security team not allow her on the premises of a bar when he was doing another publicity tour. She also traveled to the Cannes Film Festival, where she met up with a group of Armie Hammer fans, and she tracked him down in Nice, where he was shooting the film Rebecca. After the allegations had been made public, sometime later, she'd also sent some extremely explicit messages to Armie, expressing how she missed him, how she felt about him, and they were kind of like sexually violent a little bit in nature, similar to the way Armie had texted her when they were still having their affair. At the time, Armie responded that they could be friends, but he couldn't engage with her in that way anymore. The article also points out that in all this time, Effie never signed an affidavit swearing to the events of that night. It's suggested that this may have been why her attorney Gloria Allred dropped her as a client at the time. This article then goes on to talk about the show House of Hammer and the testimony of Armie's victims in that show. And they also talk about an interview where Armie's now ex-wife, Elizabeth Chambers, spoke a little bit about his recovery. Apparently he's in a very great place and he's being a present father. A day after that interview, some screenshots came out which showed Elizabeth coordinating with Effie in this public attack on Armie Hammer. So Elizabeth, Armie's then wife, was expressing appreciation for the fact that Effie had come out with all this information, and she also encouraged her to keep coming out with statements and saying that Armie needs to be locked up and she wanted custody of her children. Then sometime later, it was reported that Elizabeth was feeding tips to a friend who she was instructing to then tell the press as an anonymous close source. And according to the friend who asked to remain anonymous, she wanted to support Elizabeth initially because she was going through a difficult divorce, but she felt that the efforts went too far. His then wife Elizabeth also wanted Armie to go through some kind of evaluation because she alleged Armie was targeting girls as young as 15 and he was a psychopath. The FBI became involved, and Elizabeth said that 17 girls had come forward with allegations against him and that he'd been assaulting girls for 5 years. Ultimately, at the time, the outcome of all of this was that psychologists didn't question that Chambers was a good mother, but they had concerns that she might have been wrapped up in the narrative of the story about Hammer. They'd also concluded that he was no harm to his children. They also concluded that his preferences for BDSM practices are fetishes and not crimes, and his profile didn't present psychopathology. Couldn't find any data indicating that he was a perpetrator of sexual violence, and the same against minors. The latest update as of February 2023 is a woman who claimed that Armie assaulted her as well, disregarding their safe word, and she applied for a restraining order against him. However, she didn't show up to the court date and neither did he, so the case was dismissed. Additionally, Armie's lawyers had responded saying that the day that she alleged that this event occurred, he was actually in LA and not in New York. His accuser then changed the date, but it turns out he was in LA on that date as well, and there is proof both times. Stories like this remind me that victims, or rather survivors, don't have to be perfect, right? They misremember things. They can often act in ways that we see as strange after a traumatic event. And I know that false allegations of abuse are incredibly rare, but I'd be lying if I said that this didn't give me pause. Anyway, there's so much more information out there about what he's up to now and whether he could make a comeback, more responses to his interview, but I'm pretty exhausted of Armie Hammer content for now, so I'm going to end the video. Anyway, thanks for watching.